Get this thing turned on here. It's great to be here with you guys. I really feel like I'm with people who are really making a difference in this part of the country. A great group of men who are leaders here and changing the world for Christ in this part of the world. We're going to look back at 1 Peter. I'm going to make, if you're on the third page of your notes, I'll make a little bit of adjustment in the order in which I was going to do things. And there, just above, relating to the structures of society, is where we are. And I was going to go to that little last section there on the power to live other lives in an ungodly culture. That is, the ways in which God has empowered us to do that, the impetus behind that. But I think we're going to deal with that in the last session and move on more directly to relating to the structures of society. And here we're going to take up that household code that we talked a little bit last evening. In chapter 2, beginning with verse 11 and going forward, Peter first kind of introduces the basic way he wants us to live, and then he applies it to different areas of what we call the household code. So look at verses 11 and 12. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Going to that basic theme that goes through the whole book of living as exiles and as foreigners, even though we may be, and many of you are, in the area of the world in which you were born and raised, we are still exiles and foreigners here because there's no place here where we belong. Our citizenship and our home is with God and is not here due to our new birth. And he exhorts us then to holy living and staying away from sinful desires that wage war against our soul. And then encourages us to live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So he wants us to live lives that are such exemplary lives before those around us that they will see what we're doing, and even though they may initially be critical of us and accuse us of wrongdoing, they will be people who eventually glorify God on the day he visits us, which seems to refer to when Christ comes again. And so we're hoping that many of the people around us who criticize us and don't like us will in fact be a part of the people of God when God comes back, and will be able to rejoice and glorify God at that time for the salvation that they're receiving as well. And then Peter takes up first our relationship to the government, and then slaves' relationship to their masters, starting in verse 18 and going through the end of chapter 2. And then wives' relationships to non-Christian husbands in chapter 3, the first several verses there. And then husbands and their relationships to wives. And finally, beginning in verse 8, all of us and our relationships to each other. We talked a little bit about the household code yesterday during the question and answer session. Noted that it goes back at least to Aristotle, and that it was advice given by various pagan philosophers and others as to how the head of the household ought to conduct himself in relationship to the other members of the household. The master to the slave, the father to the children, the husband to the wife. And one thing that we didn't point out then that relates to this first section of verses 13 to 17 in 1 Peter chapter 2 is that Aristotle and others often discuss this household code notion in connection with the subject of politics and in connection with the subject of the health of the nation. And basically, Aristotle's idea was that to have a healthy nation, you had to have healthy households. And healthy households then contributed to a healthy nation. I think all of us would agree with that basic idea, even though it comes from a pagan philosopher. But it was not unusual then to discuss one's relationship to the state in connection with that discussion on the household codes. And so although Paul does not do this in Ephesians or in Colossians, where he takes up the idea of a household code, and as we talked about before, modifies it, and Peter modifies it as well in a distinctively Christian fashion that we don't find elsewhere in ancient literature, especially there addressing the subordinate members of the household, not just the master, the husband, the father, but also the children and the slaves and the wife. Peter also adds in this section something that Paul doesn't, and that is a treatment of relationship to the state. And so let's take a look at verses 13 and following. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but don't live your freedom as a cover-up for evil, rather as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. The underlying text here simply says, honor all. It's the same word that is used at the end of the verse for honor the emperor. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers, that is, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. And so in this section, Peter calls on Christians to be good citizens. And he calls on them to be good citizens in a situation that was much more difficult for them to be good citizens than it is in our situation, even whatever may be our foreseeable situations. Because here we are talking about living under the tyrant Nero and under the governors that Nero appointed or Nero kept, many of whom were corrupt. And many of whom from time to time broke out against Christians and did many corrupt things. And in the midst of that, Peter says to submit yourself to the emperor and to the governors. And he states the generalization that governors are sent by the emperor to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. And generally that's true, but there were many exceptions to that, from the emperor all the way down. And so if you know very much about Nero, you know what an amazing thing it is for him to say, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to the emperor, and then to conclude this passage with honor the emperor. Nero was appointed emperor at the age of 17. By his mother Agrippina, after she had apparently been involved in the poisoning of her husband, the emperor. The emperor Claudius was apparently poisoned. I've had some discussion with some folks here about different kinds of mushrooms. According to the ancient historians, she had him poisoned by mushrooms. And so she chose the poison mushroom for him to eat, and ended up putting Claudius to death in order to put her son on the throne. Now her son, Nero, was accused, we don't know for sure about this, but he was accused of having incest with his mother, Agrippina. He was not well thought of by the populace. He was thought of as a completely amoral individual and a tyrant. Who often did many acts that were disapproved by the people. Even though he may have committed incest with his mother, what he certainly did was put his mother to death. So in AD 59, which likely would have been before Peter wrote this, Nero had his mother put to death. He had his mother put to death partly because she really wanted someone else to be an emperor other than him by that particular time. He had Seneca, who was a philosopher at this time period and was an advisor to Nero in his earlier years. He had Seneca drink poison and commit suicide because he didn't like Seneca. And in terms of sexual immorality, this man had numerous women and men that he had relationships over the years. He had 5 wives and he had 2 husbands. And one of those husbands, he himself dressed as the bride and called this person his husband. With the other one of the husbands, he had castrated and he had her treated as the bride. And he called himself the husband in that particular relationship. It is such a man that Peter says, submit yourselves to every human authority for the Lord's sake, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to the governors that are sent by him. It is to such a man that Peter ends verse 17 with, honor the emperor. He surely cannot mean honor in the sense that you approve in any form or fashion of many parts of this man's behavior. He has essentially to be talking about honoring the office and submitting to the office. So we're talking here, we look at some of our presidents and we think well, these people are dishonest and they chase after women and this, that, and the other. We have all kinds of disapproval of them. We're not close yet to a man like Nero. And it's a man like Nero that Peter makes this exhortation about, to submit to and to honor the emperor. And so it's really a rather striking comment about our relationships to those structures of society. And through doing that, what Peter wants to accomplish by that is he says in verse 15, it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So he wants a Christian to live in such a way that they're not considered those who are rising up, say, trying to overthrow the government, but those who live solid, good, moral, holy lives that are commendable for others and submit themselves to the situation as it is, which of course none of them had the opportunity to change. They couldn't even vote in terms of any opportunity to change, but just submit themselves to the going government. Then look at what he says to slaves next. Slaves in reverent fear of God. And notice that in both cases, both in talking about individuals and their relationship to the government, where he says, for the Lord's sake, here he says, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters. Now, the particular word that he uses here for slaves, by the way, is not the usual one in the New Testament. Most of the times in the New Testament, a slave is referred to as a doulos. That's a common word throughout the New Testament for any of you that have a little background in Greek somewhere. But here he refers to these slaves as oikotai, and that is household slaves. The word oikos meant the house, and these were household slaves, not slaves who might be serving in a mine somewhere, not slaves who were slaves of the emperor, but slaves who lived in various individual households, people who had become Christians. He exhorts them in the reverent fear of God to submit to your masters. And now look at the next part, because this is the part that really kind of choke you up. Not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. If you were a household slave in the Roman Empire and had a considerate master, your life might not be so terribly bad. And in fact, there were people who put themselves into slavery deliberately. Slavery during the time of the Roman Empire was very different than what we think of as slavery, because we view all slavery through the slavery in the Americas that was put to end, at least in the United States, in the 1860s. There are many differences. One thing is that slavery had no relationship to race. Slavery involved people of all kinds of ethnicities. Another is that slaves were often encouraged to get an education. In fact, in household slaves, they became doctors, they became teachers, they became individuals that ran businesses, sometimes in other cities, for their masters. And so, to a certain extent, there was often encouragement to receive an education so that you could perform these particular functions in the household. Another major difference is that many slaves were manumitted or freed. And in fact, it was very common for someone to serve for a slave as a slave for a limited period of time. And in fact, it seems to me that perhaps a better analogy to at least some Greco-Roman slavery than what we think of when we think of American slavery would be military service. Because in military service, when you put yourself into the military, you make yourself a slave of the government for a period of time. And the government will tell you when to go to bed, when to get up, what to do all day, and they may put a gun in your hand. Well, they will put a gun in your hand, and they may put you in front of somebody else with a gun in their hand trying to kill you. They have ownership of your life for a certain period of time. And yet, for a variety of reasons, including self-improvement, many people join the military. Often people join the military for the education, for the benefits, and they join it for a period of time, and I think once I get through this, I'm going to have this benefit and this benefit and this benefit. In the first century, there were people who became slaves for the same reason. They entered voluntarily into a temporary period of slavery. Now, that is not to say that all first century slavery was like the American military, and we should think fine about it, because there were in fact harsh masters that were incredibly brutal. The Emperor Claudius, that I mentioned, is the one who served before Nero. I believe he is the one that there is a story about where he visited a man who was known for having a pool full of eels, that when a slave misbehaved, he threw the slave in the pool. And while the emperor was visiting, in fact, something like that came up. A slave actually made a mistake. Not really any kind of deliberate behavior, but made a mistake in serving the table where the emperor was sitting. And the slave owner had him thrown into this pool of eels. It infuriated the emperor, even though the emperor was a tyrant and was in many ways not a good man. He thought that this was arbitrary and ridiculous, and he had the pool filled with dirt and told the man to stop doing that. But it didn't put him in jail, and it wasn't illegal. In the first century, you could put your child to death, or you could put your slave to death, and no one, or you could put your wife to death, and no one was going to come and get you and put you in jail. Those kinds of things were a part of the master's prerogative. And so when Peter talks about not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh, he can be talking about various amounts of extreme harshness. And yet, what he encourages these slaves to do is to submit themselves to these masters. Whether it's a good, considerate master, the kind you might want to be under, the kind that through temporary enslavement. And in fact, another thing I should mention is that you could be a slave of a Roman citizen, and when you became a free person, you were a Roman citizen. So another thing that you had potentially gained from it is you might gain Roman citizenship by a period of slavery in the first century. So not only to those good masters, though, but also to the harsh. For Peter goes on to say, it is commendable if one bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. Again, it is because of their submission to God that they submit to the owner. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and you endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God, and to this you were called. It's an amazing thing that he encourages these slaves to do, to even submit and take a beating for having done nothing wrong. In fact, they might end up submitting and taking a beating for being a Christian. And you're definitely, when you're talking about these harsh masters, we are presumably, in the vast majority of cases, talking about non-Christian masters. So just as when he turns to wives, he's going to be talking about wives whose husbands are clearly not Christians. He is likely here talking about slaves who have become Christians, but their masters are clearly not Christians. And so here in these first two sections, and we'll get later to the section about wives, Peter exhorts Christians as citizens to submit to and even honor the emperor. And Peter exhorts Christians as slaves to submit to. And although he doesn't say honor, I suppose it would not be terribly surprising if there had even been a verse here in which he said, give honor to your masters. After all, he has just told us in the previous verse to honor everyone. So to even give honor perhaps to a harsh master. And his hope in all of this is that those who are critics of Christianity will be put to silence. Their ignorant, foolish talk about the nature of Christianity will be brought to an end. And in fact, he has hopes in some cases, as he will make clearer when he talks about wives and husbands, that the non-Christian will look at the way in which the Christian behaves and will think about becoming a Christian. Look at that first verse in chapter 3. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words, or even without a word, by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and the reverence of your lives. And that is that through the wife's behavior, she might end up converting her husband. And all of us know situations, if you've been around for a while, in which that has happened over the years, in which a wife's good and pure behavior has eventually led to the conversion of the husband. Now, all of this section about the household codes, and particularly the relationship of citizens to the government, of slaves to their masters, and of wives to non-Christian husbands, raises a question that has been a major focal point of a lot of the scholarship on 1 Peter for the past several decades, going back at least to 1982. In the scholarly literature, you would, if you read much of it, you would read at some point very quickly about the famous Balch-Eliot debate. There was a man named David Balch who had devoted a lot of his life to the study of 1 Peter. and another named John Elliot. Both of them had devoted a great deal of their time to the study of 1 Peter, and people were observing that they took a very different viewpoint about what Peter was trying to do with regard to what he was encouraging the Christians in this way of living, particularly in the household codes, but also in other parts of the book. And so they were brought together in a kind of debate forum in 1982. And Balch, and both of these, I'm not going to advocate either one of their positions, but Balch said that in his opinion, what Peter was talking about was assimilating and conforming to the society around you, and that was fundamentally all he was talking about. And he pointed to some of the verses that we would see here, as in verses 13 and following: submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Submit to the emperor. Submit to the governors. Honor the emperor. And then he would turn and talk about the slaves, that you should submit to your masters, not only if they're kind and considerate, but even if they're harsh. And then he would turn and talk about the wives and the ways in which they were to submit to their husbands and try to win them over without a word. But Balch's analysis of this is that Peter's emphasis is simply on conforming to the expectations of the society around us. Now, if we're asking which one of these guys is more right, it is surely not Balch. It is surely not Peter's basic thrust of the book as a whole to say, become like the society around you. And Eliot had a very strong realization of that, and he emphasized excuse me, that all of the submission that is being talked about here was to be done for the sake of God and for the sake of the possibility of converting and leading to the evangelization of the world around them. And that many places in the text made it clear that Christians were not to conform to the world around them, but were to be different. He would point to chapter 2 and verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles, abstain from the sinful desires which wage war against the soul. He would point to chapter 4, verses 3 and following. You have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you don't join them in their reckless, vile living, and they heap abuse on you. It's very easy to point to many texts in 1 Peter that call for us to be holy and different. They call for us not to live like the people around you. And yet it seems that Eliot could only see this aspect. It was as though Balch somehow had some blinders on, that the only thing he could see when he looked at the text was, you need to get along. You need to make your accommodations. You need to submit to those who are in authority. And on the other hand, that Eliot, when he looked at the text, could only see, you need to be different. From his point of view, there was absolutely no accommodation, absolutely no adjustment to the society around them. From Balch's point of view, that is all there was. Since that time, and we're now 30 years plus past that time, the Balch-Eliot debate has been very famous in 1 Peter scholarship, and generally people bring it up and they discuss Balch's view and discuss Eliot's view, and then they go on to say they're both wrong. That in fact, Peter talks about both. That he talks most essentially about being different from the world around us, but that he also talks about relating in a submissive kind of fashion to the structures of the society around us, obviously to the extent that one can, and still maintain one's Christian convictions, because they're obvious. If we turn, say, to the book of Acts, we will see times at which those in the book of Acts stood up and said, no, we can't do that. Are we to obey God, or are we to obey men? We're always to obey God. And Peter, who's the one who says that in Acts, is not in this book advising anything different, but he is advising and honoring of a tyrannical, immoral emperor and many governors who were the same, and a submissiveness to even harsh masters who gave their slaves a beating when they did right, and not necessarily when they did something wrong. There have been many ways that different scholars over the years have tried to express what Peter is expressing here and sum it up. And I'm going to skip most of those for the time being. If you want to ask a question, and we look at some of those a little bit more later. Some of them I don't like the language at all, or I think maybe they don't understand the English language well, or I just don't understand them well. Like the very first one, the emphasis on soft difference. Difference is the emphasis on being different than the world. Soft is the emphasis on submitting or accommodating to those things which we can. That's not the language I would prefer. The language I would prefer is either Darrell Bock's, that the Christian should act with conviction and civility, or the one at the bottom is my own wording, and that is that the Christian should act with conviction and at the same time with compassion. Let us look at some of the verses in which Peter seems to bring these two things together. One would be chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, which I know we've referred to several times, but which is very key for the book. I urge you as foreigners and exiles, abstain from the sinful desires that wage war against your soul. There is clearly the conviction to live holy lives. But as he goes on to say, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And that is, he calls for us to live holy and good lives, not only because of our relationship to God, but also because of our relationship to others. We need to get involved in doing good in our communities, in doing good for other people, and sacrificing for other people in such a way that those who are not Christians will look at what we are doing and they'll say, I'm interested in that. I want to be a part of a group of people that would live that way and do that. And then in chapter 3 and verse 1, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them don't believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. He's apparently here speaking to wives who have non-Christian husbands. And he's telling them that the best way to convert your husband may not be to nag him every week about whether he goes to church with you or not, or about this aspect or that aspect of their lives, but rather to live this exemplary, sacrificial Christian life before them, so that they at some point say, wow, I want that. I want to find out what that is. And he even talks about here converting people without a word. And we may do the same thing to those around us. They may look at what we do in feeding the hungry. They may look at what we do in the way we reach out to people that are completely different from us, in the way that we serve and sacrifice for those around us, and may come to say, I want a piece of that kind of life. I want to find out what they're doing. In your office place, you may be the person who is the serving minister to everyone, and eventually someone that you would never imagine would be interested in Christianity may come to you, particularly a crisis point in their life, and say, what would you do about this? How do you think about this? And that may be the open door. You may convert them without a word. Now, I don't want, and I'm sure Peter doesn't want to say, you can convert people without ever mentioning Jesus Christ and without ever telling someone the gospel. I'm not at all wanting to be heard to say that, but I am wanting to be heard to say, often people have to know how much you care about them and who you are before they'll listen to those words that you might tell them about the gospel. They don't care what you care about until they know that you care about them. And if what you're trying to do, is sort of start arguments with and win them over to Christ by arguing with them, you're not going to get nearly as far that way as you are in the way in which Peter discusses. And then look at chapter, let's see where I am here. I've lost my place. Chapter 3, verse 14 and following. Very important verses that we haven't looked at to this point, where Peter says at the end, in verse 14, even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Don't fear their threats, and don't be frightened, but in your heart should be your Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Here Peter encourages us to be ready to defend what we believe. And yet to do it, he says, with gentleness and respect. There is a time for harsh language. There is a time for, as Jesus does, calling a group of people a brood of vipers. Those may not be the first words that come into your mouth. Someone needs to be rebuked. But using some harsh or rebuking terminology in some situation. But Peter talks here about a different kind of approach that in most cases is the approach we need to be using. And that is an approach that's firm and shows conviction, and yet on the other hand is gentle and respectful. In the language that's used by Darrell Bach, shows conviction and at the same time civility. In the language that I'm using here, shows conviction and at the same time compassion. Compassion because what I really want to emphasize here is that we react this way, we do things this way because we love that person and we want that person to become a Christian. Even if they don't love us, even if they detest everything we stand for, we still want the opportunity to come up for us to lead that person to Christ. And so we speak to them in a way that shows our convictions, and yet on the other hand shows our compassion and our care. I think that's where we'll end things for this particular session. I think I've taken about 40 minutes, and we'll pick back up in the last session with some of the rest of this. Thank you very much.